Today we are in the middle of a worship series looking at the intersection between faith and politics. The purpose of this series is not to tell you how to vote, but is instead about how we can engage faithfully in what is often a very contentious political reality beyond our doors. Last week, we talked about the fact that this is one of the most divided periods in American history. In fact, the data shows that from a congressional perspective, this is the most polarized period in American history. Given the fact that our country's founders believed this type of polarization was one of the greatest threats to our nation, it is important that we start to pay attention to the reality of the divisions we face. And by naming where we are, we can start working toward where we want to be. As Christians, we are called to be a reconciling presence in our world. This was central to Jesus' ministry and teaching. And at the heart of that message was the call to love our neighbors as ourselves. We are even called to love our enemies. That's a tall task for sure, especially when the stakes are as high as they are right now, and so many people and organizations are stoking anger and division for their own benefit. But that doesn't mean it can't be done. It can be. And just as Jesus modeled, it starts one encounter and one relationship at a time. Today, we are going to look at some specific steps you can take to practice reconciliation and grace in the midst of the divisiveness we face. Some of the things I'm going to share today come from two people I had the chance to spend some time with at a conference last year that was focused on how to build common ground. The first is Keith Allred. I talked about him quite a bit last week. Keith is the executive director of the National Institute for Civil Discourse. The second is Nisha Anand, the CEO of Dream Corps. Both organizations bring people from across the political and social spectrum together so that they can work toward the common good of all people. And I am grateful to have learned from their experience and wisdom. We'll get to some of the things they suggest in a minute, but first I want us to turn to some wisdom that's found in the 4th chapter of Ephesians. Rather than read the entire passage, I've broken it down into bullet points for clarity. Put away falsehood and speak the truth with your neighbor, for we are members of one another. In a world where politicians and some media organizations promote lies and misinformation, it is essential that we be a people who speak truth to one another and that we remember we are part of the same body. Like it or not, we are in this together. Be angry, but do not sin. Anger, no matter how righteous, is not an excuse for destructive behavior. It is okay to be angry. And there are some legitimate reasons to be angry when it comes to the political realities we face. Let that anger motivate you, but try not to let it get the best of you in ways that cause harm to others or run counter to the principles of our faith. Let no evil talk come out of your mouths, but only what is good for building up. If what you are about to say, write, or post on social media is for the purpose of breaking down, demeaning, or dehumanizing someone or some group, please don't do it. Look, I get the desire. Some of those memes are spot on and it can feel good to share that perfect zinger. But to what end? Now, this doesn't mean you can't stand for what you believe is right. It doesn't mean you can't say, write, or post things that support your position or oppose the position of others. But as this passage in Ephesians goes on to say, we are called to do those things in ways that give grace to those who hear our words, even if we disagree with them. Put away all bitterness, wrath, anger, wrangling, and slander, together with all malice. Most of this is straightforward and builds on what we just talked about. For those who aren't familiar with wrangling, it basically means arguing on and on and on without letting the conversation go until you win the fight. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. Again, there is no excuse for cruelty, especially for those of us who call ourselves Christ followers. Some folks have gotten so mean lately, and unfortunately, an increasing number of Christians are not only tolerant of such behavior, but they are also making excuses for and defending their favored politicians when they say or write cruel, demeaning, and dehumanizing things. Being kind and grace-filled is not a sign of weakness. In fact, it can take a lot of strength, especially in the midst of our current political and social environment. Practicing these things from Ephesians would go a long way toward being a reconciling presence in today's world. With these scriptural instructions as our primary foundation, let's look at some tips for reconciling dialogue that you can implement during a difficult conversation. The first tip will not only establish some common ground, but it is also essential if you ever hope to shift someone's opinion. When you are in dialogue with someone you disagree with, don't question their intelligence or morals. For example, asking someone how they can vote for a candidate you think is a terrible person or questioning their morals for supporting a certain policy is not a great way to begin a conversation, even if you're right. Think about how it feels when those kinds of words have been directed at you. Have you ever changed your position about something or opened up your heart and mind to building common ground with another person after they just called you stupid or immoral? Doing this kind of thing will cause defense mechanisms to kick in, walls to come up, and any hope for a productive conversation will be lost. This goes back to that advice from Ephesians. Only speak what is good for building up, not breaking down. Along these same lines, when in conversation with others, inquire instead of indict. Ask questions that will help you understand where they are coming from. As you do so, regularly sound back what you are hearing. Try to recap what they've said before offering any response. This does a couple of things. First, it helps to make sure that you understand their point of view and why they feel that way. Second, it lets them know that you are really listening to them, as well as giving them the opportunity to clarify their position. If possible, as they are speaking, try to find a point of connection and or empathy. You don't necessarily have to voice this out loud, but try to identify any truths you may be hearing. Is there anything you can agree with? Are you hearing any fears, worries, or hurts that might be driving their position? People experience life differently. And just because you haven't experienced something they have doesn't mean their experience isn't real or that it didn't impact them in a way that you don't understand. By listening for a truth or empathizing with a life experience they've had that is shaping their views, helps to establish some common ground on the issue, as well as honoring the humanity of the other person. Every person you meet is carrying some kind of pain or brokenness. They are carrying fears and worries. They are also carrying hopes and dreams. They are a person, a child of God, just like you. Remembering this is a key step toward loving our neighbor. In the book, See No Stranger, author Valerie Kaur refers to this approach as practicing wonder, which she describes this way. Seeing no stranger begins in wonder. It is to look upon the face of anyone and choose to say, "You are a part of me I do not yet know." Wonder is where love begins. But the failure to wonder is the beginning of violence. Once people stop wondering about others, once they no longer see others as part of them, they disable their instinct for empathy. And once they lose empathy, they can do anything to them or allow anything to be done to them. Entire institutions built to preserve the interests of one group of people over another depend on this failure of imagination. Now, this kind of practice can be hard. Sometimes it's easier to imagine the worst about people than the best. And sometimes it's easier to hate others than to love them. But as Christians, we are called to do that hard work. It is the essential essence of the gospel call. Once you've really listened to the other person and sounded back what you've heard them say, then, if you really want to engage further, the next step is to ask, would you like to hear a different perspective? I love this question because it gives the other person the chance to decide if they are open to more conversation or not. You aren't holding them hostage to your ideas, but instead are inviting them to practice the same type of listening you just modeled. If they say no, then let it go. End the conversation and let them know that if they are ever interested, you'd be willing to re-engage. If they say yes, then the fact they've given you permission to do so tends to make people more open to hearing what you have to say. In this same vein, do not say or let someone end a conversation with the phrase, "We will just have to agree to disagree." We need to erase this phrase from our vocabulary for so many reasons. First, it not only ends the conversation, but it shuts down any opportunity for moving toward common ground. It lets us off the hook for doing the hard work of finding mutual understanding. Not only that, but when it comes to some issues, I am not willing to just agree to disagree, because sometimes there's too much on the line for that. We are facing serious challenges as a nation, and throwing our hands up and walking away from solving them simply because we disagree is not acceptable. The stakes are too high. The people who depend upon us to solve the issues that are impacting their lives deserve better. We deserve better. Politicians and other people in power want us to stay stuck in our disagreements because it is to their advantage. We can view things differently and still work toward common ground. If we just agree to disagree, we'll never get there. A more constructive and healthy response is to say, I see it differently. That makes it clear where you stand on something, but doesn't shut down any further conversation or movement. Another good practice is to focus the conversation on what you are working toward instead of fighting against. This doesn't mean we can't name and call out people and policies that are causing harm to us or others. We've got to do that. We must speak up for justice and equity. At the same time, by focusing on what we are working toward, we are elevating our hopes and ideals instead of magnifying our fears. We are reminding ourselves and our conversation partner of the better world that awaits us on the other side of our efforts. Finally, let me say this. While we all bear some responsibility for engaging in difficult topics and conversations, no one has to suffer harm or abuse in the effort. If a conversation partner attacks your personhood, or if they use cruel and demeaning language, you are under no obligation to stay engaged. This is especially true for those of you in marginalized communities. Work toward what is right. Fight for what you believe in, but practice self-care as you do so. All right. While there are certainly more steps that we can take to be a reconciling presence in the midst of the divisions we face, these are a good start. Give them a try and take note of your experience. What worked? What didn't? What was this like from a faith perspective? Next week, we're going to continue our series by talking about the politics of Jesus. While Jesus was here to bring about personal transformation, he was also here to usher in societal change. If we choose not to recognize that part of his ministry, we will never realize the world he envisioned. I hope you will join us for that conversation. Amen.